Hey there, this is Rebecca Koffler with Censored but Not Silenced. I have a daily intelligence briefing for you today, which will focus on 5-point strategy that would have prevented Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I often criticize Washington's actions in response to Putin launching an invasion of Crimea and in Ukraine, in the last one in February 2022. I often give commentary on TV, radio, podcasts, all sorts of media, where basically I express my intelligence analysis, assessing whether this or that measure that Washington takes, trying to end the war, which is basically President Trump's objective. And my assessment is usually no, sanctions is not going to work. Providing more weaponry to Ukraine is not going to work. It's not going to compel Putin to end the war. And then the question often comes up, well, what will work? Many of my readers and my clients are interested in knowing, how do you actually stop the war? Well, when it comes to Ukraine war, it is impossible right now to stop. There's nothing short of basically conceding and giving to Putin every single request that he submitted, right? Every demand. And that is because we virtually don't have any cards. NATO and the United States doesn't have the cards against Russia because we were unprepared. Putin prepared for the Ukraine war for 20 years. He developed a very sophisticated strategy. So once the war started, it's virtually impossible to stop. But it would actually behoove Washington and Brussels to develop what I would call a counter strategy to Putin's playbook. I described Russian warfighting doctrine and strategy at the unclassified level in my book, Putin's Playbook, that was published in 2021. It is an unclassified version of classified doctrine and strategy that I briefed many times when I served in the U.S. intelligence community. I briefed it to top military commanders, U.S. and allied commanders, to President Obama's White House national security staff, and I briefed it to NATO in 2013 in September, just a few months prior to the invasion of Crimea. So we had all of the information at our disposal to be able to develop a counter strategy, but the Pentagon and its NATO counterparts never bothered to do that. And that's why we found ourselves in this situation. So, but it's still not too late to develop this counter strategy in order to deter further invasions. Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, actually made an assessment that I'm sure it's an overall NATO assessment that was declassified, that in about 5 years, Russia will be combat ready to conduct another invasion, including of a NATO country. I concur with that assessment that Russia will be combat ready. I do not concur with the assessment that Russia actually would invade a NATO country, and I explained it previously in my podcasts why. Basically, Putin is not suicidal. He's a rational actor, and he doesn't want to trigger Article 5 collective defense. But Putin does have a few other countries on his target list, and those are primarily the former Soviet states, such as Moldova. So I don't rule out the possibility of Russia conducting another offensive military campaign against a country such as Moldova. And that's where the 5-point counter strategy comes in. Why does NATO want to develop that, or must develop? It is, in fact, it's imperative why NATO must develop that strategy. It's because when it comes to Ukraine, a lot of the military planning that went into the preparations, Russia's preparations, specifically General Staff, that's the entity that does what the Russians call strategic planning, the conceptualization of the warfighting strategy, which is based on Russian military doctrine and a series of other strategic planning documents, such as the cyber doctrine, the space doctrine, nuclear doctrine, etc., etc. So a lot of that had nothing to do with the plan for Ukraine, and it had everything to do with planning on how Russia wanted to prevent the United States and NATO from intervening directly into Putin's war on Ukraine. Okay? So it had everything to do, all the focus was placed on developing an effective deterrent strategy to keep the US and NATO out of the battlefield, out of Ukraine. And this is why what Washington, basically Putin gave a checkmate to NATO by having that strategy, which, like I said, I described in my book, Putin's Playbook. That's why what we had to do is conduct that proxy war by supporting Ukraine in its fight, which from my perspective, I think it's not going to help when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but it would deter future invasions. So in order to develop the counter strategy, you must first understand Putin's strategy and then develop key elements to address the elements of the Russian strategy. Okay, and I'll just name it to you very briefly. The key elements of Putin's strategy are based on Russia identifying key vulnerabilities in the US and NATO's way of war. And its key staples of the Western way of war is basically money and technology, right? Unwisely, our national security apparatus believes that if you throw enough money and enough weaponry, enough technology at the problem will go away. Well, it's not true. We learned that in Afghanistan, obviously, after 20 years, $2.2 trillion, 6,000 American lives alone. In 20 years, we had to withdraw. And Afghanistan basically reverted to the same chaotic state, dangerous state as it was before. Taliban is back in power, right? Well, what the Russians have done is they developed an asymmetric strategy. They also call it strategy of indirect action. What is an asymmetric strategy? Asymmetric strategy is usually a strategy that a weaker power develops in order to defeat a much stronger opponent. And since NATO, Russia's assessment is NATO is conventionally and technologically superior to Russia, that's why they developed that strategy, and they borrowed a lot, ironically, from the renowned British strategist Sir Liddell Hart. He advocated what's called an indirect approach. He recommended bypassing the adversary's stronger points and focusing on the weak points and exploiting their vulnerabilities. So the Russians identified major vulnerabilities, such as in US and NATO's way of war, and that is extreme reliance on space, technology, cyber for every aspect of warfighting. So every aspect of our warfighting, intelligence collection, targeting, precision strike, troop movements and communication is reliant almost 100% on satellites. Missile warning satellites, intelligence satellites, imagery satellites, you name it. So Putin's plan basically has 5 elements on it that I described in the book, and that is space, cyber, espionage, something called active measures, which includes destabilization operations and election interference, and military element, including nuclear. So, because the Russians developed very sophisticated doctrine and full spectrum capabilities to exploit those vulnerabilities, the US and NATO could not deploy forces into the theater in Ukraine. So, what I recommend in order to prevent, and I made those recommendations, like I said, in the back in the intelligence community. So what needs to happen is we need to close those vulnerabilities to change Putin's decision calculus to exploit them. So it's very simple. So you gotta just close these vulnerabilities. You can't. And so what specifically do I mean? We need to secure our space-related infrastructure, both satellites and the ground segments, because Russia has a very robust arsenal of counter-space weapons designed to degrade and destroy US and allied satellites in the time of conflict. Those elements include those counter-space weapons and capabilities include GPS jamming, lasers, orbital interceptors, and direct ascent anti-satellite missiles that go into each of the orbits, or target rather, satellites, US and NATO satellites in each orbit right now. So even the latest intelligence assessment, the 2025 annual threat assessment that is done annually by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, I'm just gonna go ahead and quote for you here. That assessment reveals that Russia continues to train its space forces, fielding new anti-satellite weapons, and is already using electronic warfare to counter Western space assets. Moscow is also developing a new satellite that is meant to carry a nuclear weapon as an anti-satellite capabilities. Okay? So our satellites still continue to basically be sitting ducks in the orbits for the Russians to target. So what the Russians plan to do is, if there's so basically my assessment is that the Russians are not going to attack a NATO country, but unless NATO decides to directly intervene in a conflict in Ukraine or a similar, future conflict. That's when the Russians would attack a NATO country or NATO assets, including preemptively. But they're not gonna actually wait until we start, flowing forces into the theater. Their way of fighting, and you got to understand that with every adversary, you have to understand their way of fighting, right? And so what the Russians plan to do, because they understand how we fight, that we relied on what's called the network-centric warfare, which was developed by Garska and Chebrovsky. These were the two military strategists in the Pentagon. And it's very heavily reliant on cyber and space. So what the Russians plan to do is disrupt early in the conflict our entire kill chain. What is a kill chain? It's basically a concept developed by the Air Force, which effectively is a process, which often is automatic, for military decision making, aimed at destroying, or rather first detecting, targeting, and destroying enemy targets. And how do the Russians plan to do that? Exactly what I just said, by attacking our satellites and attacking our cyber networks. So the first element of the strategy is secure space-related infrastructure. The second element of the counter strategy, US NATO's counter strategy, should be to harden critical infrastructure against cyber attacks. Okay, the Russians have one of the world's most dangerous and destructive arsenals of cyber weapons, and a very sophisticated doctrine and advanced expertise. They've been targeting US and NATO critical infrastructure with non-destructive cyber intrusions for the past, since basically 90s, right? So that's more than 30 years. And yet we still have not protected our critical infrastructure. The very first major Russian cyber operation against US cyber networks was called Moonlight Maze in the 90s, where they exfiltrated massive classified data, including from weapons labs. So they've been developing access, they've been pre-positioning access to critical facilities in the US and in Europe. What are critical facilities? It's the 16 sectors that former President Biden actually stupidly gave a list to Putin, a list of those 16 sectors. It's transportation, it's energy sector, it's financial, it's hospitals, and so on and so forth. You can actually find this list on the DHS website. So President Biden gave that list to Putin and said, "Do not touch those." Well, how silly! Of course, Putin is not gonna listen. In fact, the Russians, back in around 2012, they developed what they call a strategic operation to target critical infrastructure facilities of the adversary, because in U.S. government, in its infinite wisdom, U.S. government decided to publish those sectors in unclassified arena, unclassified realm. So, quoting back to you from the threat assessment, the 2025, that assessment with which I agree 100%, states that Russia's repeated success, I quote, in compromising sensitive targets for intelligence collection has helped it to preposition access to critical infrastructure in the US and Europe. And Russia's particular strength and practical experience is in integrating cyber attacks with military operations in wartime. So they have competitive advantage because that's what they've been doing in Ukraine. The United States does not have experience in integrating cyber attacks with military operations in wartime because we haven't been in the war against Russia, and I mean against Russia specifically because we're in a proxy war. We haven't directly engaged in the war in Ukraine. So number 3 is establish stronger protocols to guard undersea communication cables. A lot of the cables, or rather a lot of the power cables and communication cables, both in Europe and in the US, are located undersea. Well, the Russians have a top secret program that is called GUGI, which is basically a deep research. They call it deep research program, but it's a cover. It's really a program to target those cables. And there have been suspected sabotage operations of undersea cables in the Baltic Sea since the war on Ukraine began. And a similar risk also applies to energy pipelines. In 2022, the UK's Minister of Defense actually acknowledged that the UK Royal Navy was deploying into the North Sea to assist Norwegian forces in protecting gas pipelines after the rupture of the Nord Stream pipeline, Russian pipeline in the Baltic, which in my assessment is, and a lot of people disagree with that, but in my assessment, Russia is behind. Yes, many people think that it's crazy that Russia would attack its own pipeline, but I actually put out an unclassified intelligence assessment that is published in the form of an analytic piece on the Fox News website, where I basically explain the rationale why Russia did that. So if you're interested, you can check that out. So the next one, the number 4, is bulletproof against the Russian espionage. And the 5th is establish advantage in total combat potential. I'm not going to focus in this episode on bulletproofing the Russian espionage because in a way it's a no-brainer. But I have a piece published in the Telegraph, British Telegraph publication that goes into that. Unfortunately, the title of the piece is different than the title of this episode. The title was selected by the editors. That's always the editor's purview. The title of that piece is Putin is preparing for another invasion while NATO is fatally distracted. But what the article, but that's not the central point of the article. The central point of the article is those 5-prong counter strategy to Putin's playbook. So in conclusion, I'm going to just focus on the 5th prong of the counter strategy that NATO must develop, and that is establish advantage in total combat potential. So what does that mean? What is combat potential? Combat potential is a combination of the size of the armed forces, the size of the weapons arsenal, the military-industrial complex's ability to scale up production of military hardware in order to win the war, and defense economics. Why can't we give more weapons to Ukraine right now? Yes, the U.S. and NATO is trying to flow, in my view, unwisely, because there's no amount, we don't have enough weapons. We have depleted our own, the United States, weapons arsenal to very dangerous level, and so has Europe, and we don't have the capacity to restock. Whereas the Russians do. The Russians, in fact, produce more military hardware in 3 months than Europeans produce in 1 year. Why is that? Because Putin transitioned his military and economy on a wartime footing 7 years prior to the invasion. So and that's why it is my assessment that that right now Russia holds advantage in terms of total combat potential. In layperson's language is, we don't have the cards. That's what President Trump likes to say. And he did in fact say, he said, Putin holds all the cards. That's why even though sanctions or whatever President Trump is trying to do, it's not going to work. So, but it will work against the next invasion if we actually develop the strategy. So yes, NATO committed, many NATO, if not all at this point, NATO members committed to increase their contribution towards the collective defense kitty for 5% of their GDP, right? Just a few years ago, only 8 countries out of 32 NATO countries were paying even 2%, right, during President Trump's first term. Well, finally they woke up, or Trump, basically compelled them to do so. But again, weaponry, right, and money by itself doesn't, and weapons, they don't shoot themselves, right? So you need to recruit, train, and equip a fighting force that is sufficient to change Putin's decision calculus. What is sufficient? Well, actually, the Russians have an algorithm for it. We don't have a way of determining what, or at least like a way. We haven't used the algorithm to determine what is sufficient to actually deter Putin. Okay. In fact, many countries, or very few countries in Europe, even have mandatory military service. And the others, so far, they're not even considering it. Okay. On the other hand, the Russians, Putin has been conducting mobilization throughout this conflict in Ukraine, both in overtly and covertly. And just a few days ago, there was a bill introduced in the State Duma, the Russian parliament, introducing a year-round conscription for military service. So if approved by Putin, which my assessment is that it's going to be highly likely approved by Putin, the law will come into effect on January 1st, 2026. Putin already has maxed out the size of its armed forces above the constitutionally allowable limit. So in 2025, as of 2025, Russia has 3.57 million troops, with 1 million point 32. I'm sorry, with 1.32 million being active military duty, active duty personnel. Okay, compare that with compare the 3.57 million for the Russians with 3.44 million active duty personnel that NATO has, right? So Russia has more troops to throw into the meat grinder. The technical term is war of attrition, which is what the Russians are fighting in Ukraine right now. The Russians can fight until the last Ukrainian, and if Putin were to invade a NATO country, which he's unlikely to do, like I said, he's not suicidal, but if he were, he could fight until the last NATO person, because they simply have more people. And like I said, there's many countries in NATO, most countries don't have a mandatory conscription. So how do you change Putin's decision calculus, right? If he knows that Russia holds advantage right now in total combat potential, including in the size of the armed forces. So I'm going to stop right here because it's getting long already. If you have any questions, hit me up on social media. I'm on X at Rebecca0132. I publish my analysis in various publications, and follow me, help me grow my followers so that also more people become aware of how Putin fights, what's coming, and whether we should or should not be, throwing good money after bad in a situation where money does not actually solve the problem. I repeat, weapons, money, and technology do not win wars. Strategy does. So it's high time that NATO develops that strategy in order to deter wars. The stupidest way, as Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military strategist, said, the stupidest way to fight a war is to actually, have the forces clash on the battlefield. The smartest way to fight a war is to win without fighting. And how do you win without fighting? You change your adversary's decision calculus to fight with you. So you need to demonstrate to them that you're going to win, that the cost of starting a war for the adversary is going to be much higher than the benefit derived from that war. And right now, we can't demonstrate that to Putin, at least not in Ukraine. Thank you, and I'll catch you later. Rebecca Koffler was censored but not silenced.